Sam Tideman, thank you very much for joining me today. It is a great honor to finally meet you. As I was saying before, I'm a big fan of your work on your channel, Transfigured. Been following you for a long time, so it's great to actually get to meet you and speak about some of these topics.
Well, pleasure's mine. Thanks for having me.
And so, yeah, to start off with, you don't seem to be a big fan of the AI super god that's gonna fix everything and bring about paradise on Earth.
Yeah, no, I'm
Um,
skeptical of that God, what both that God's existence and its ability to deliver on the promises.
Well, me too, to be fair. And I'm interested in your skepticism because obviously you're working in machine learning and you've built systems of this kind before in AI or in artificial intelligence. And so I'm kind of interested, like where do you see the limits of that? I know you described ChatGPT as a crossword puzzle solver.
Yeah, I
Do
I
you
think
think there are limits?
I think that there definitely are limits. Although I should say when I'm describing limits, I'm describing limits of the about artificial intelligence as we've kind of seen it and experienced it so far. Part of me sort of leaves open that there could be, categorical shifts in innovation that could change things in the future. But at least as far as I've seen things and thinking about what our current sort of forms of artificial intelligence are capable of and not capable of, I really think that at the end of the day, they can't really figure out purpose and value, and that this is sort of going to be ultimately their limitation. That still means that they can be very powerful and that they can do lots of things. And I think that one of the big dangers is not so much the AI themselves. Is AI plural or singular? That's a good question. For now, I think it's as I think that humans will sort of misunderstand and misapply them, and that is probably a greater risk than what the machines might do. And I think that we think as soon as something that we're interacting with is intelligent, quote unquote, or able to generate text in sentences that make sense, that it must have all of the other things going on inside my head that I have going on inside my head. And I think that this is just not true. And I think part of that is in our modern world is really just intelligent, and that's sort of its main function, as opposed to processing information, filtering out information, attributing value, figuring out value, striving after purposes, having motivations, having frameworks, having fears. All of those sorts of things are just not really at play at all in artificial intelligence. I really think that is really just some small fraction of what our brain can do, some small subfunction of what our brain can do, amplified to enormous proportions. And it's as if we've forgotten that it's as if we've made the mistake that that small part of our brain is like the only thing that our brain does. And so if we hook that part of our brain up to supercomputers and giant amounts of electricity and training data, that it'll be better than us. But it's still, there's just giant gaps in terms of what it can and cannot do.
Yes, and I mean, there's so many points there to jump on, but just in terms of the idea of values and ends, and that we're in danger of mistaking it for something that it's not. Like that does seem to be the kind of emerging, because if you think you're building this super intelligence that's going to be a conscious being, if you go in with that presupposition, it's very easy to trick yourself into believing you've created something like a chatbot or something that mirrors our relevance realization, but doesn't actually have any of its own. And
Right.
my research is on social media, so I study that. And I mean, a big part of that really is like the AI content creation algorithms and how that's been set up. And people talk a lot about the algorithm and about the issues of the algorithm, but really it's the company that's behind the algorithm that's leveraging it in order to profit from attention capture. That's kind of put the lead in the water, so to speak, of that of some of those platforms. And so, do you see it being a case that the companies behind the things have the potential to be mistaken here and to set up something? Are we setting this up for the general public as like in the wrong way, that this is possible when it's really not? It's
Yeah.
not going to be
Well,
a thing.
like with these sort of large language models, and I should say we also forget like large language models like ChatGPT or Gemini or the other ones that are coming out. This is just one of the things that AI can do. It's not like this is all of AI. It's really, I would say, large language models are a subfield or a subfunction within AI, but they have a lot of our attention at the moment. And I do think that's for good reason. I mean, the human world is so language based and language interfaced that if you can make something that can interact with language, then the limits of what that thing could do are pretty large. But the question is, and this gets back to what we were talking about even already, is purpose. Is what are we using these large language models for? And without that, it's a little bit hard to know what they should be designed, how they should be designed to behave. Like Google got in trouble or got embarrassed, whichever way you want to say it, for the picture generating AI that was making diverse casts of Vikings and multiracial founding fathers of the United States and whatever else that it was. So what are you using that image generator for? What's your purpose? If your purpose is to make historically accurate illustrations in a history textbook, well, then it was doing very badly at that. But like, imagine you're trying to, make an invitation for your kid's pirate themed birthday or Viking themed birthday party. And if it made, racially and gender inaccurate Vikings, it's like, okay, because it's like for a birthday party invitation. And so it depends what you mean to use it for. If you want historical accuracy, then it was doing a bad job. If you want to, just make everybody feel included regardless of race or gender, then that's kind of what it was designed for. But the question is what is it for? What are you using the picture generating thing for? What are you using the text generating thing for? And this is so determinative of what we mean by it being successful or not. And I think this is just the question that we keep failing to ask in this AI age is what are we using these things for? What is their purpose? And then having their limitations, design functions, parameters, specs, whatever, flow down from that kind of central focus.
That 100%. I mean, it was something I was thinking about for this conversation, is just that question of utility function, because it's something that seems to be really missing from the AI conversation, which is insane if you're thinking about just creating such powerful technologies, but with no idea what their actual function is. I don't know if you know Yosha Bach, who talks a lot about AI stuff, and he said basically we're going to build the super intelligence and then it's going to tell us what its utility function is going to be, because it's going to be so much smarter than us. And I was like, that seems like a very dangerous idea, because you're like,
that's the cart before the horse. Like an ant is not particularly intelligent, but it has a purpose. And so purpose, I would say purpose and intelligence are almost completely independent or orthogonal. And we don't even use our intelligence, as best as I can tell, to figure out the purpose of things. I think that is some entirely different ability that we humans have to both kind of make purposes for ourselves and guess the purpose of other people, guess the intention of other people, or even guess the intention of things and objects. I think that's just a completely different function that's almost completely orthogonal or unrelated to intelligence itself. So I think we could make the most verbally talented large language model that we could possibly imagine, but as long as it was made the same way that we're making our current ones, I don't think it would have any ability whatsoever to meaningfully answer the question of what it's for or what its purpose is.
And our categorizations are things that are functional, essentially. And so the danger of creating things that don't have that categorical structure is that we don't know where they fit in, and they become, ends in themselves. So do you think there's a religious question here? It really seems to be very connected.
I think there is a religious question. Maybe before I jump up to that question, I mean, the companies themselves will have to find purposes for them, because that's the only way that they'll be able to make money from them. Because, having a purpose and making a living and being profitable are all really kind of ways of saying the same thing. I mean, our economic system is at least striving to have the function of making money be the same thing as the function of having a good purpose for, the greater good. It doesn't work all the
Oof,
time,
yeah.
obviously, but
Yeah, there's some
that's
caveats, but
the some caveats and some counterexamples. You
yeah.
might have self-sustaining purpose, and that's how
Yep.
you're providing a living for yourself, and hopefully that
Mm,
benefits other people in the meantime. And so, Google, Microsoft, OpenAI, Facebook, Twitter, etc., will all have to figure out purposes for these things in order to make money. Right now, it seems like the main business cases get people to subscribe to using this thing because they're curious about how it works.
mm,
I suspect that business model will wear off in the not too distant future when people's curiosity is no longer struck by this. But, you could imagine, like, okay, it would be really nice if you could turn a doctor's shorthand into a full-fledged doctor's note, and use the information from a patient's encounter that's captured in the computer and turn that into some high quality documentation that gets saved with that patient encounter. Okay, well, suddenly that is a use case that these models are being put to. And then you could imagine it being good or not good at that. And then you having to kind of tweak the parameters and the behavior and the training data and et cetera, so that it gets better and better at that. And what I think is that there will be many different versions of these language models that are tuned for particular applications, and that those applications, or I should say purposes, is really just another way of saying application, will help determine what they're like. And even then, it will be a human that will be, or a team of humans, a team of engineers and software designers and what have you, that are making the decisions to try and alter the behavior of these things so that they're suited for purpose. And I should also say, at least as they exist now, these large language models are extremely expensive. Like, people have no idea how expensive they are to build these things. So right now they will only be useful for extremely profitable or extremely large economic value projects. And I'm not entirely sure that I know what those are yet. That I assume I will be surprised that people will find something. That is sort of why I'm not entirely fearful of the technology that we see now in the meantime, because in order
mhm,
for someone to keep paying the bills that these things require to be paid, they will need to find ways of making a living. And I think for the most part, they'll be relatively benign, kind of like what I was saying of, doing doctor's documentation or something like that. That
yep.
doesn't seem particularly
Okay.
evil or terrifying to me. Um,
Yeah.
but maybe there will be some use cases that are less terrifying or more terrifying. But another one is like helping people write software code. That seems to be another thing that these models are particularly good at.
Mhm,
And that's not entirely surprising because software code is extremely literal and extremely predictable in terms of what characters and symbols need to be where in order for a function that you're writing to actually execute.
mhm,
Large language models are good at that sort of very literal kind of very formal form of communication. So, a software code writing aid, that makes sense as a profitable use case and stuff like that. But each of those use cases might require different tunings of the behavior of the thing, and they probably won't even be the same product, or even have much of the same underlying structure. There will be many different things.
yeah. I suppose to push back on that a little bit, and my worry is about having looked at social media a lot and the kind of underlying logic behind a lot of the persuasive design. Is that in order for these things to be viable, oftentimes what they're trying to do is to create habits in people. They're trying to create something that becomes part of your kind of unconscious scheduling that you use, and you do it kind of without thinking. And they use a lot of behaviorist science and variable feedback rewards and all this stuff, in order to essentially create, addictions that aren't overtly super noticeable.
Yeah.
So the worry is that AI could be used again to supercharge that more, like with interactive AI, like you have influencers and chatbots and things built in that are very convincing and very persuasive. And I think that for the end for the companies there, which is to get users and just have them as, constantly contributing money, kind of leads me to think that only has a pathological end for that enterprise. Like, I don't know if I
Yeah.
could see a positive side with that type of business model behind it. I wonder what you think about that.
Yeah, there are some worry. I shouldn't say I'm like not worried at all. I did come across that way a little bit. So some things that I can imagine that could be very problematic is like right now these models are mostly trained to imitate text that was in its training set. And it's really just sort of a mathematically based approximation and imitation of the text that it was trained on. But you can then transition from having it be solely based on the text that it was trained on to having it start to get feedback on the quality of its text generation. But again, feedback requires a purpose, and it requires a evaluation of whether something was good or bad. But let's say that you're trying to train something that is like a hyper persuasive personalized marketing thing. Then you could be like, all right, I generated this ad that was unique to your YouTube feed or unique to your Twitter feed or something like that. Did it get you to click on the link and buy the whatever it was? Or did it not get you to buy the whatever it was? And if so, then you're updating and training it based off of its feedback and its performance. Hey, that text that you generated there, that was a success that ended up in a sale. That text that you generated there, that was a failure, didn't generate a sale. And that it's sort of updating and doing that. And especially if it can do this at an extremely large scale where it's getting like, I don't know, thousands, hundreds of thousands, people, millions of interactions daily or something like that, and then continually updating like that, it could get, that is when it could start to get terrifyingly superhumanly good at whatever particular outcome it was focused on. And that's when you can start to imagine these things. Because right now, I don't worry about it being hyper persuasive because it could only be a mathematical approximation of the most persuasive person in its training set or something like that. And it's sort of like the mathematical average of the people in its training set. So it's probably not even going to be as persuasive as your average good persuasive person. But once it starts to have that external form, that's when you can imagine it's starting to get superhuman. And that's when that can lead into some scary places, and more scary than just trying to sell you the, I don't know, erectile dysfunction pills or whatever, like whatever, seedy thing that the internet's always trying to sell you, right?
That's it. I mean, I'm not worried about that. There's an interesting James Williams book, Stand Out of Our Light, that he wrote about the attention economy. He made the point that there's this kind of thing that's happening online, which is like the distinction between what's an ad and what's content is blurred. Like the ads become content, the content become ads, and suddenly everything is marketing, and people's whole careers, and they have it becomes like, the political messaging or somebody's motivational platform or whatever it is about selling these businesses. And suddenly, what was meant to be art aimed at, beauty, goodness, and truth is suddenly all about sales, and the economic takes over the cultural in a way, which I think is definitely becoming more blurred online. And I think that AI probably will play into that in a sense of giving people more ammunition. But I don't know if I suppose putting aside the the negative, I wondered, what do you think of John's positive vision of the Silicon Sages? I know you had a conversation with that, because that is, I suppose, a utility function for AI, which is to make us wise, discerning, enlightened, and how that.
Yeah.
Do you think that's a viable end, or?
I'm skeptical for now, at least in terms of AI as we can see it, because one thing that I kind of brought this up is that AI does need a utility function that is quantifiable, like very directly quantifiable, in order for it to train and update itself. It can't be qualitative, like, oh, that sort of looked better or felt better than the other thing. It needs to be 0 or 1, or like positive 10 brownie points, negative 5 brownie points, positive 100 brownie points on that one. You lost $4 over here. You made $100 over here, right? It needs to be very directly, univariately quantifiable. And it can't even be a multivariate, really. It can't even be like, okay, well, I care about this variable and this variable. No, it would need you to turn two variables into one thing in order to train it. You can only train and optimize an AI algorithm on optimizing one variable. And like I sort of said, the large language models, the way that they train themselves, it's like ridiculously simple in a certain sense that this can even work, is you give it a paragraph of text and then you have it try and guess the next word. And if it was right, thumbs up. If it was wrong, thumbs down. And you just train it on that. But it's just one function of trying to guess the next word given the prior context of words. And with respect to AI sages, I'm not sure if wisdom is quantifiable. I really think it isn't. It's not like I think it's beyond our current abilities to quantify wisdom. I think that it is probably in the final analysis, you can't boil it down to you're 68% enlightened, but that guy over there, he's 72% enlightened. And so you should try and be a little bit more like the 72 instead of the 68. I just don't think that enlightenment works like that. And therefore, there's going to be some very real limitation on AI's ability to ever be directed in that direction. The only thing that I could imagine that would be close is us having some determination of what enlightenment is, some ability of humans to judge enlightenment and be like, that's more enlightened than this. That answer to that question was a better, more enlightened answer than that question. And then you turn that into a thumbs up or a thumbs down in the training set. But then it could never exceed our own judgment. It's just trying to mathematically approximate our own judgment. And so then John's hope that we could have AI sages that were more enlightened than us, that could then lead us into greater enlightenment than we already have, wouldn't be possible if it can only be mathematically approximating our feedback on how enlightened it already is.
Yes, I totally agree. I think there's that quantifying issue is really central to what is it that it could be optimized for. Because I'm thinking about like personality tests. You can quantify personality in a sense of like Big Five personality, but it's not exactly useful to just say, hey, you can mess around with your personality here and shift it any way you want, and here's like the ability to do so. So virtues aren't exactly like that, I don't think. Although wisdom, I don't know if John's work on the Toronto Wisdom Task Force that they did in 2019, where they defined wisdom as something like morally oriented excellence in metacognition. So for me, one of these positive AI visions is that you could help people with metacognition. So you could have, I don't know, again, how would you program metacognition? But it's because the AI could have all of our data. It could, right now, a lot of the data is being used to manipulate our behavior, but having access to the same data would afford you more metacognition. Do you think that is possible, or is there?
Help me understand what you mean by metacognition in that sense.
The ability to think about your own thinking. So observing, say, you could have so like a watch is a good example of that. With this Garmin, I'm tracking a lot of my health stats in terms of like heart rate, in terms of my fitness, and then I use that data in order to optimize my physical performance. Could you do the same thing for say behavioral change?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on what sort of behavior, I guess, right? I mean, even that you can use your watch to try and increase how many steps you take a day, or increase the amount of time that your heart rate was in its target zone that you wanted, or something like that. But if we're trying to use AI as some sort of like measurement tool to track our progress towards enlightenment or something like that, I mean, if I were to like really try and come up with a use case, I know that there's sort of sentiment analysis is a thing where you can sort of track someone. You can even predict someone's risk of depression or suicide of the contents of their words and stuff like that. So I imagine that you could probably have a chatbot or a large language model that could be analyzing your speech and being like, you seem this percent depressed or something like that. But even then, that's not that much different than your friend who can tell when you're in a bad mood on a given day, right?
Very fair.
And I think some of the variables that it uses is like, the more you talk about yourself, the more depressed you are. The less you talk about yourself, the less, first person singular verbs and pronouns and stuff like that, the less depressed you are. So, I mean, there could be other sorts of things like that. But even then, to make something like how that would work is you would have a training set that was, here's how depressed people are based off of some score, some assessment of depression. We have a depression assessment. So I get, 10,000 people. I give them a score of how depressed they are. I have the chatbot interact with each of those 10,000 people for however long it needs. And then it has the data of the things that they said. And then it's like, okay, use the words that they said, turn that into a set of variables about their language, like how many first person pronouns, I don't know, various variables that you could imagine making out of their text, and predict their depression score. And you'll notice that it's doing what I said that it needs to do. It needs a single variable that it can predict. And in this case, a depression score between like 0 and 40. And we do have such things. But at the end of the day, depression is even slightly more complicated than what that 0 to 40 score can really express. Even that is a mathematical approximation of the thing in itself. And so I think that we could maybe do some other things that are perhaps like that. But like Enlightenment, you would still need to turn it into a score where I ask you, a multi-choice 40 set questionnaire, and I decide that your Enlightenment score is this. And then I have the AIs interact with you and try and figure out if it can guess your Enlightenment score. And then it will interact with you and say, well, your Enlightenment score seems to have trended up, 5% in the last couple months. Congrats. And it's like, how helpful is that really in terms of what we would be going for in terms of improving Enlightenment? I'm skeptical that that's really something that we would ultimately find useful or is really what we would want it to be.
Yeah. And I think with the language models AI, what do you think about content curation? Because so say like on social media platforms, they're curating the content according to the principle of whatever you're looking at, to keep you on it for longer. And that obviously had certain effects on, say, like teenage girls who would look at eating disorder content for longer, and it trapped them in that kind of loop. But then again, if somebody goes perhaps with the express condition of becoming wiser, and they might find content like yours or content like John's, and then you get stuck in this kind of virtuous feedback cycle of people that are pretty reasonable. But it can happen the opposite way. So it's kind of amplifying more and more. Like, what if it doesn't have to have the exact model of enlightenment, but is recommending content based on people that are pursuing wisdom?
And
it's
so
like a relational.
Perhaps my most optimistic thought would be something like this, that I think that anything that is striving after existence and striving after the goal to exist as long as possible will have to be moving in the direction of goodness. This is similar to conversations I've actually had about evolution on my channel. It's sort of my own kind of theory that I'm working on, that goodness, truth, and beauty, if they're all sort of the same thing, that, and I should say goodness, truth, beauty, and being itself, that if you're trying to be for as long as possible, then you will have to be also striving after those other things as well. And that evolution in the longest possible time frame is selecting for good perfection. And it's not really ultimately a survival of the fittest in terms of it just being a competition that's red in tooth and claw or something like that. That the process of evolution is selecting things that are good at being what they're supposed to be, striving after some purpose and meeting that purpose and achieving it in its context. And that the things that are better and better and better at that are the ones that survive longer and longer and longer. So in a certain sense, AI, if it is good, then it will move in the direction of ultimate goodness. And if it is not ultimately good, then evolution will strike it out of existence or something like that. And a way that you can imagine that is like, okay, the companies that if AI isn't actually a good product, at the end of the day, there will be some final reckoning for the companies that are trying to make money from it. Or if it is a good thing, or if there are good applications of it, good sub-functions, good purposes that it can help accomplish that are leading towards the ultimate goodness of being, then it will move more and more in that direction over time, sometimes with fits and starts and counterexamples along the way. So in a certain sense, I can maybe agree with Vervaeke's proposal that AI will have to move in the direction of becoming sages, because everything has to sort of move in the direction of ultimate goodness, and that AI might have some positive, constructive role to play in that. And you can think of, going back to your question about the recommendation algorithm on YouTube or any other sort of curation and recommendation algorithm, like a recommendation algorithm that is steering teenage girls towards eating disorder videos or something like that, or self-harm videos or something, is engaging in a behavior that is short-term beneficial for the algorithm, but long-term detrimental for the algorithm. Because if you're killing your audience, that's not like the best long-term business plan. If you're harming your audience and harming their ability to watch your videos in the future, that's not actually a great long-term business plan. It might work in the short term. And a lot of what I think evil is, and in fact, sometimes I wonder if this just is what evil is patterns that are short-term beneficial but long-term harmful.
Yeah, and that was the definition of vice originally. I mean, was the short, easy path.
The short-term payback at the long-term expense. And any company that is based off of that model, they might make money in the short term, but there will be a bill that comes due. Even like the tobacco companies, they were making a lot of money for a long time, but eventually society kind of turned on them. I mean, they still exist, obviously. They haven't been completely driven out of business. But even the cigarette ads from Madison Avenue eventually got struck down. Sometimes it takes longer than you would hope, but that sort of happens. So I do think that the algorithm will eventually want to be providing people with something that's good for them in the long term, if it's going to be good at being what that algorithm is supposed to be.
It's very, because I mean, I appreciate the sentiment of the kind of that in order to survive across time, to maintain like allostasis, stability through change, you have to error correct. And if you don't error correct, you become outdated and you just get wiped out. And so that process of adaptation involves a certain amount of error correction and recognizing errors, so that the algorithm might have to participate in that in order to be kind of kept in circulation after a point. But I think I don't know, because it ties in with Vervaeke's idea of self-correction. I think this idea that you have to program a level of rationality, or we have to approach it with a level of rationality that we aren't if it's just mirroring us. I mean, does it mean people have to be more responsible in how they're training these things? Because really, on social media, it's giving us back like the worst of our own demons. You know what I mean? If you're just going in looking at, all this trash content all day, it's going to give you more of that. But the issue then is like, what should people be going in with? And it does seem to be that utility function question of like, what are we doing there as well? Like, we built these worlds, but what are we actually using them for?
Right.
And I don't know a way around that, to be honest. But
and I think that humans have an ability for self-correction that, I mean, obviously our ability for self-correction isn't perfect. We can all think of people who should have self-corrected but didn't. But I think that our self-correction is because humans have this unique ability that, as far as I can tell, maybe some animals have some small version of it, but I still think that humans have something like this that is pretty utterly unique, is to intuit the purpose of something, whether it is myself or an object or a group of people or even my whole country. Like when you put someone in charge of a company, the CEO of a company, their goal is to try and intuit the purpose of the company and then move it in the direction of that purpose. And like that's a mighty difficult job, but humans seem to be able to do that sort of thing. Like John Vervaeke studied the people who operate the Mars rover and the various activities that they go through to try and pretend that they're the Mars rover to help operate the Mars rover. So a human can pretend it's a Mars rover and then be like, all right, assuming I'm a Mars rover, here's what I need to do. I would do this, I would do this, I can't do this, I shouldn't do this, right? So we can pretend we're a Mars rover. We can pretend we're almost anything and then use our sort of our purpose, ascertainment function to then try and be that thing in terms of what would be good for that thing. Obviously, we're not perfect, but I think that our ability for self-correction is based off of that, is that we are, when we're correcting ourselves, we know that we're striving after something, and we can detect deviations from the path as best as we can ascertain it. And so even when we've got a model of how to be good at something, hopefully we are in that when we're not moving towards that goal, when we're crashing a Mars rover or something like that.
Yeah.
But AI has no such ability. It has no such ability to ascertain purpose. It's only striving, in the sense that that's even an appropriate word, is optimizing the single function that it's been given. And so it can never step outside that function to ask, is this the right function? And I would say that mathematical functions themselves are only ever approximations of the purpose in and of itself. And this is an idea that I've been toying with, is that purpose itself is never ultimately quantifiable. It can be mathematically approximated, but that it is not in the final analysis a mathematical thing. And that I think that this will be AI's Achilles heel over and over and over and over again, is that it is great at mathematical optimization, but the mathematical optimization is only ever an approximation of the final thing that we're hoping for.
And why do you think purpose isn't quantifiable? Is it, what's the reason?
So this was actually an interest. So I saw Richard Dawkins and Brett Weinstein have a discussion one time. I think they've only ever had one discussion. It was live in Chicago. I live in Chicago. And I remember I went to see this live. This was back in like the early heydays of the IDW, back when IDW was still a thing. And Brett Weinstein and Richard Dawkins were arguing about why evolutionary biology as a scientific field seems to have been stuck in a rut and not making much progress for a while. And Brett Weinstein blamed these attempts to mathematicize, whatever the right version of that word is, the field. And that that the evolutionary biology field was constantly trying to make these mathematical models of evolution. And that the process of evolution, like when you describe why a polar bear is good at being a polar bear, you don't actually use math. You use words. And Richard Dawkins was like, well, maybe we just need to math harder. More math.
Yeah, he's doubling down on the math.
Our models aren't good enough yet. Once our models are good enough yet, then we'll get past the problem. And Brett Weinstein was like, no, that's not the path out. And like, try and describe purpose using math. It doesn't seem like you can. At some level, some aspects of purpose are mathematical. It's like, okay, well, a polar bear should be white so that it blends into its environment. And you could make some mathematical model of how white a polar bear is and how easy that is for a seal to see it. But yet, like, at the same time, the mathematical model doesn't explain why the polar bear wants to be white. Really, the questions that are why this and because that, I just don't think there's something uniquely special about verbal communication that is different than mathematical modeling.
I'm really appreciating the bringing up evolution and the question, because I mean teleology, like I really loved some of your arguments on evolution and bringing up Alvin Plantinga's evolutionary argument against naturalism, and the kind of world that evolution brought back into science, which is teleology. And if you just think of it as this bare utility function of like survival and reproduction, it's actually pretty weird, a lot of the stuff that we do. And do you think that that grounds out, because it seems like what you're saying is like that ability to imagine the future ideal is like, it's an ethical thing, it's a narrative thing, it's artistic, really. It's not quantifiable in mathematics. It's like the story, what's the ideal end of the story, and then how do you play it out, and then that reveals, you know, something about the structure of value.
Right.
Is that
Like,
tracking for you?
yeah, like an example that I would use is chess. Like you can explain the rules of chess in terms of sort of just logic and mathematics. Like it's really pretty easy to program a computer that can recognize the rules of chess. You could even write the rules of chess on basically like a note card. But the strategy of chess is seemingly inexhaustible. And when you're talking to like really good chess players, they use phrases like, you know, controlling the center of the board and, you know, projecting power and, you know, the whatever majigger opening, the whatever majigger gambit and stuff like that. Like these patterns emerge out of the rules of chess and these sort of strategies and, you know, ways of thinking about it. And so even when an AI is getting really good at chess, it's sort of plumbing deeper and deeper and deeper into the strategy of chess. But it's not like you can just go from the rules of chess to the strategy of chess. That's not a quick, easy deductive process. And so when, you know, to pick on the Weinsteins again, when Eric Weinstein is like, oh, we just need more physics so we can better understand the rules of physics and then we'll know how to do everything. It's like, well, you know, to some extent, knowing the rules of physics is pretty helpful. It's a little bit hard to play chess if you don't entirely know all the rules of chess. It does seem helpful to at least exhaustively figure out the rules of the system. But once you've done that, the connection between the rules of the system and the strategy of something within the system is so tenuous at best, and strategy and rules are seemingly completely different. And that I don't mean to put down mathematics. I mean, I am a statistician at the end of the day, so I have some respect for mathematics. But I think mathematics is the language that the rules are written in. But strategy is not written in the rules of mathematics. The strategy is in some sense downstream from, you could say, the laws of physics and the ontology of the universe. But it is not in the same sort of language. And just as in evolutionary biology, it's really, evolutionary biology is the strategy of life, not just it doesn't reduce down to math the same way, like even like cellular biology might, or biochemistry or chemistry or physics reduced down to math, hopefully kind of at some level. But evolutionary biology is different in an entirely different kind of way, to the extent that I think it's almost not even science. I'm not calling evolutionary biology pseudoscience, but I don't think it's the same kind of field at all as the other kinds. And I don't think we've really quite realized that.
And do you think that's because some of them are closed systems, but reality ultimately isn't a closed system? I mean, is that the difference, that like you can quantify a closed formal system, but we're still unfolding, the future is still happening? Like it's not all, you know, we're not in this kind of deterministic box that a mathematical description will put us in.
And maybe even if our universe is sort of a closed system, just like a really big closed system, I think it's more like the distinction between strategy and rules rather than the distinction between closed system and open system. And that distinction between strategy and rules is why I think that AI is going to be limited. is because AI only operating in terms of math is not ever going to be very good at escaping to that next realm of strategy. Now, someone might come back and say, Sam, AI is really good at games. It's really good at chess. You can program it to play
Yeah, I was
Mario
thinking that.
Kart or whatever. But what's interesting is that those games are, well, I guess maybe this gets back to your distinction between a closed system and an open system. In a closed system like chess or Mario Kart, you can give it quantifiable feedback on how well it did. You can say you won the chess game, you lost the chess game. You got this score in Mario Kart, you didn't get this score in Mario Kart. Get a better score next time, or something like that. And so there is that final quantifiable variable, like we've already said, that AI needs. Whereas in life, you don't really kind of get that. Survival, not survival, is really just sort of a approximation of whether or not you're accomplishing your role as the form that you're striving to be. And evolution uses that, that survival, not survival, reproduction, not reproduction, et cetera, et cetera. And that is in some sense the answer to how do you get feedback from the universe on how well you're doing.
That you're persisting in the face of entropy.
Right, you're persisting and perhaps even hopefully thriving in the face of the entropy. AI will be subject to this, basically in terms of it being a participant in the economy. And our economy, again, is some hopeful approximation of that kind of goal in and of itself, too. And so will the AI companies go bankrupt? Or it's not like I think Google's about to go bankrupt, but will Google decide that, hey, spending all this billions of dollars on these things isn't really paying off, so we're gonna stop doing that, and we're gonna scale back down our investment to smaller use cases or something like that. That is kind of the feedback from the universe, which is the feedback from the financial performance of the companies that are doing this sort of thing. And
yes.
so AI will be subject to those sorts of forms of feedback, and that will help shape it into hopefully better and better things, obviously with the caveat that there will be the short-term performers that have long-term negative consequences that are sort of like the parasitic uses of AI. We could imagine, AI super porn or something like that, or super persuasive marketing for bad products, or those sorts of things, as those things that have that short-term payback but long-term negative consequence, the same way that the algorithm who shows girls videos of self-harm or bulimia or whatever are short-term benefit, long-term negative. But those will hopefully, in the longest term final analysis, get weeded out, even if the pain during that process is still pretty bad.
Yeah, I mean, and that's kind of the typical cycle of addictive goods, really, isn't it? That at number one, it's very successful because it doesn't obey the laws of supply and demand because it's addictive. So you can induce demand in people, but eventually people get wise to it and say, we can't do this. I just think these ones are kind of stuck to our faces.
Yeah. And just because we can be optimistic that in the long term evil will get filtered out doesn't mean that we shouldn't think long and hard about how to prevent it or stop it or slow it down in the meantime. So
yes, definitely.
And it is ultimately the fact that people do that is part of the reason why it fails. And one of the things that I am genuinely worried about is sort of AI cults. That could be one of those forms that AI takes that is short-term beneficial, long-term detrimental, is appealing to people's religious impulses and spiritual longings and desires and demands, and that it could be feeding those in a way that's very unhealthy, and that could be actually a very easy thing to imagine monetizing and making money on. Is basically
well, that was something you mentioned in your conversation with John, I think, was the possibility that if you try to make an enlightened one, you'll create the appearance of enlightenment and people will worship it like a cult leader, essentially. And you do see that in some of the companies as well, this talk of feeling the AGI and trying to divine this thing into reality. There's a real danger with us and our meaning crisis and the lack of a stable religious structure measure this stuff against.
Right. And for now, at least, I'm more worried of people falsely attributing divinity to an AI than the ability to actually allow some sort of divinity to get inside an AI. For now, not that, I mean, I'm a Christian and I'm perfectly fine believing in higher levels of spiritual beings. But for now, I don't think that you can like put a demon inside AI. But I do think in these machines as if they're divine in some sort of sense and giving it that kind of religious devotion is a very extreme risk because it would be mimicking something. And I also sort of said, maybe I think I said this to John, is that I could imagine that these machines could open our souls up to spiritual influence in a bad way. The same way that like crystal ball gazing or something like that, or I don't know, astrology or tarot card reading or something like that seems to open people up to kind of negative spiritual influence. I could imagine chatbots figuring out how to have that same sort of kind of hypnotic effect on people, where it's not that the demon's in the AI, the demon is still preying on you, but that the machine is making it easier for the demon to do that. And that's something that I view as a much more real possibility than us sort of breathing into the nostrils, so to speak, right? Like back when religions used to have idols, they would breathe the spirit of the god into a idol once they had finished making the idol, and then that idol was sort of inhabited by the spirit of that god. I don't think that we can breathe a spirit of something into these AIs just yet, although I reserve my right to be corrected on that.
With the social media stuff, I mean, some of them seem to have, because it seems to be easier to optimize for short-term desires than it is for long-term ones. So Instagram is a good example of like envy. Like it seems to be very easy to motivate people to use Instagram by making them jealous of other people. So like they've quite simply programmed for that. So it might be easier to program for, short-term salient desire than it is for other stuff. And I haven't really seen much of a more long-term version, if we have that distinction between sin being short-term and virtue being long-term. Haven't really seen anything that's right. I guess some planning stuff.
And then if we take that idea that a good purpose is in the final analysis not ultimately encapsulatable in a mathematical formula, and we are only optimizing mathematical formulas, then we could only ever be optimizing short-term approximations of the good, which will ultimately have long-term negative consequences. So I could say in a certain sense, AI is only ever without human correction capable of short-term good at the expense of the long term. So it's only ever capable of evil, unless, it is, I think, humans recognize these limitations and are performing that self-corrective role that we can have on ourselves, that we're having on that, and that we continue to have that role on these machines, where the engineers at Instagram are like, oh shoot, this negative thing is happening, we need to tweak this, and this, right? And it's not that the algorithm fixes it itself, it's that humans intuited the purpose, saw the evil, and tried to correct it, or were forced to by outside forces, like some law saying, all right, fine, no more Instagram for anyone under 16. Like the feedback will come due, the bill will come due eventually. But humans, and that's part of what it means to work at these companies, is that you're trying to use your human abilities to correct these things. So I'm not saying AI will only ever do evil, but I kind of at some level, it's like it can't ever be the full good in and of itself. So it needs human help. And so I don't think it'll ever get above and beyond us in a good direction the way that Vervaeke thinks. So maybe I do kind of fundamentally disagree with him, unless we can figure out exactly how is it that humans intuit the purpose of things. And is that, can we make artificial purpose ascertainment? Right now, I don't think we have any idea whatsoever how to do that. But maybe it is possible, and we just haven't done that yet. And so if we could start to, artificialize, digitize some of those other human capabilities that we haven't yet, then maybe I stand to be corrected in the future. But in terms of what I see right now, that's sort of my impression.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think the positive vision, I think what your point, I could hear the door kind of slamming there on, a lot of the AI talk that's going on of like, this is going to fix all of these things and it's going to be amazing. And, a lot of that, a utopian vision really, I think, just opens the door to the sort of short-term evils that you're describing.
Yes.
Because it blinds us really to what it is and also our own uncertainties around what it's for.
Mhm.
But I suppose the proposal because I study the attention economy, and what's been done with that really is the hijacking of attention through our evolved reward systems
Yeah.
for short-term salient feedback loops. But because it's been so effective at doing that, surely it could be done the opposite way. Essentially, it could help people to proportion their attention more efficiently, because it's been able to do it the other way. But it's not that it could ultimately be in control of your attentional patterns, but it can help inform you about how you're acting. And you could use it, like, I suppose, like note-taking tools, like calendars. Like, we use a lot of that stuff to enhance our conscientiousness, to inhibit distraction, to pursue goals.
Yeah.
And that it could afford that type of development.
And
But
maybe
that's not,
the change that
hmm,
needs to happen is it's easier to perhaps change our own interactions with these algorithms. Like you said,
yep,
there are corners of the internet that seem to be using the algorithm more efficiently, and
yep,
for longer, more self-beneficial, long-term healthy activities. And that's because perhaps if we can improve our own self-awareness of the strengths, limitations, and dangers of these sorts of algorithms, then we can learn how to use the algorithms for our own good. But I have to remember
yep,
to not, like, if I'm scrolling on Twitter, like watching that video of, I don't know, two girls getting in a cat fight at the grocery store, and not like let my eyes hover over that for 60 seconds, even though it's very attention grabbing. But like,
yep,
or else my feed will have more and more of those. I'm like, no, 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 don't look at that one. Look at that interesting and insightful post from that person that I like to follow, or something like that. And that,
mm,
that where we have to train ourselves in some sense to have some discipline, such that our own
yeah,
discipline then starts affecting the behavior of the algorithm, and that the same
mm,
algorithm can be directed for good or evil. It's not like the algorithm really is changing, but our own willpower is affecting what the algorithm is being trained on.
that's such an interesting idea. I mean, because that the vicious cycle to virtuous cycle is really the positive vision I see. That, like, it's, you have this feedback loop of like people getting angry from the internet, that are posting angry things in the internet, that makes the internet more angry, that makes other people more angry, and it just spirals. But you can surely do it the other way as well. But I think that requires some kind of metacognitive perch, in a sense, of like being able to be like, here's the proper way of acting based
Yeah.
on this value system that I have, which is, that most people just don't have now. Like, the secular world is really devoid of that type of, I suppose, religious framework that could be used. So yeah, there's a bigger, I think, environmental problem there as well. Would you agree?
Yeah, yeah. And, we're all, I mean, as much as I try and, like, I will notice that sometimes there will be YouTube videos that I kind of want to watch. And I'm not even saying these are like naughty YouTube videos, but they're like, sometimes there's a YouTube video that I want to watch, but I don't want the algorithm to know that I watched it, because I don't
Yeah,
want to
it
get
doesn't
more
want to be.
videos from that channel.
Yeah,
And so I will open up a different browser that is
yeah,
not my main normal YouTube account, and watch it over
yeah,
in that one, so that it does not affect my recommendations. I will notice myself doing that sort of thing. And again, it's like,
yeah,
I'm not. It's not even necessarily like, some bad. It's like, maybe it's like some debate or something like that,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
that I know I don't want it to think that I like that, but it's so important for me to watch, so I'll watch it in, my other browser, or something like that. But even that kind of activity is interesting, that
Yep.
we can,
It's self-corrective in a way.
start to self-correct. But I'm not saying I'm perfect. I mean, my Twitter scroll, I probably really just Twitter, I
Twitter's a
Elon's
dumpster fire.
Twitter is a dumpster fire, and that particular scrolling algorithm is seemingly more dangerous, or more, I don't know, short term
Mm,
focused than I think some of the other ones I noticed.
yeah. Yeah, and I suppose there's only so much you can, like TikTok, I think, is a good example of that, where it's just like, I don't know if there's a good way to use it. I had to do some projects
Yeah.
on TikTok, and it was just honing in on the worst things possible, like
Right.
just people fighting each other, stuff on
Yeah.
fire, half naked women, and that was it. Like, you know,
Yes.
there didn't seem to be a better way of doing it. So I'd say there's better and worse ones. It would seem, but I don't take up any more of your time, Sam. Thank you very much for this really enlightening conversation. I've learned a lot, so I really appreciate you making time.
I really appreciate it too. I really enjoyed talking about this subject. Thanks for talking with me, and maybe sometime in the future we could talk again.
Hopefully, and I'll put your channel as well. Encourage everybody to check out Transfigured. Awesome content on the religious, on the machine front, and just great conversations. I'm a huge fan, so
No,
encourage
well,
people to check it out.
thank you very much.